Zdeněk. Země nikdy nebyla!
Hello and welcome to every single sci-fi film ever. I'm Aisha Khan. Today we'll be talking about the 1963 Czech film Ikarie XB-1 by Jindřich Polák. I highly recommend people do watch the film so you can put the discussion into context. And now on to my absolutely wonderful guests. Evan Torner is Associate Professor of German Studies and Niehoff Professor of Film and Media Studies at the University of Cincinnati. Welcome back to the show, Evan. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you for having me back.
Brilliant, thank you. Joining Evan is Simon Spiegel, who is a lecturer of film studies at the University of Zurich. He has written extensively about science fiction Utopia and has just released the book The Fear of Knowing, about spoilers in TV and film, some of which you will be receiving today. Welcome to the show, Simon. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, very fine, and it's great to be here.
Thank you so much. We'll go to Evan first to talk a bit about Stanislaw Lem and the book that this is not credited to, but it is based on. Evan.
Yeah, so this is another Stanislaw Lem film adaptation. Stanislaw Lem famously hated all film adaptations of his work. He was a Polish author who really wrote across 5 or 6 different areas of human endeavor, so science fiction being just one, next to philosophy, social critique, dark humor, and some other areas. So given that backdrop, the book on which this is based is called, I believe it's The Magellanic Cloud, and that is a 1955 text written shortly after his Astronautsi, which was adapted to Silent Star, previously discussed on this particular podcast. Magellanic Cloud was an inspiration. In particular, it is an exploration of the psychological effects on a human crew going all the way out to what would then become Alpha Centauri. And that particular voyage would last longer than human lifetimes. So Stanislaw Lem imagines what would happen in the 32nd century if you have a kind of humanity that is ready for this sort of voyage, and how not really ready we are anyway for that.
And sorry, did you say the 32nd century? So he did it a lot further ahead than this.
Way further ahead, yeah. And a much larger sort of planetoid-sized ship. I think it was like over 200 some people who had to be kept alive on that particular voyage. And again, the Czech filmmakers who are making Ikarie XB-1 make it leaner and meaner. It's going to happen in the 22nd century. It's going to only be 40 crew people. They do actually cast all 40 crew people. And most of them, of course, are extras, but they, in theory, have all 40 of them accounted for somewhere in the film. And it would basically divorce itself so thoroughly from the Stanislaw Lem inspirational material that I don't even think there was a dialogue about would there be credit for this film assigned to Stanislaw Lem.
The book is probably only an inspiration because in the novel you have like a first-person narrator, and you have a quite long first part which is about his history, backstory on Earth, which really there's no connection there in the novel whatsoever. And also maybe about Lem, as far as I know, there was actually at one point a meeting between the filmmakers and Lem, and he basically said, I'm not interested in that. But I might add to that, Lem was a notoriously difficult character, I think, to put it in a friendly way. I think most people who had dealt with him later ended up in very ugly fights with him. He was, I think you can say that, not a nice guy.
That is a shame because I've become quite fascinated with him over the last few months. Very interesting. Can we talk a little bit about Czechoslovakia at this time? We've got the French New Wave, and there seems to be a new wave across large parts of Europe, and you can see the influence in, even going to Hollywood films. And this film is so different from Silent Star in its visual delights.
There is what is called the Czechoslovakian New Wave, which is, as many new waves during that time, was influenced by the French New Wave, but there are notable differences. One is that still the filmmakers, they were part of the national film industry. So this is a controlled film industry, which is very different. And also in terms of stories they're telling, I think you can say they're much more like plot focused and in a way more traditional storytelling than, for example, the French New Wave, which if you look at someone like Jean-Luc Godard, you're like, okay, we're going to explode everything that is about the proper storytelling. I guess the most famous of these directors, who later migrated to the States, is of course Milos Forman, who did films like
One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is most famous in the US. Yeah,
exactly. And there was also, I think, which is someone who is very important at the time, and there is a connection there to Ikarie XB-1, Vera Chitilova. She did that absolutely wonderful, marvelous film Daisy from 1966. And interesting is that the director of Ikarie XB-1, Jindřich Polák, as far as I know, he's not really considered part of that movement. And it's also, maybe Evan knows more. He doesn't really exist in film history. There is very little literature on it.
Yeah.
And if you look at the typical overview over Czechoslovakian New Wave, he's not to be considered part of that. He's never mentioned there, at least not in the stuff I've read. But actually, the screenwriter, Pavel Juracek, he was very much part of the Czechoslovakian New Wave, and he was the screenwriter of Daisies. So there is actually a connection there.
Juracek in particular was very young at the time that this movie was made, and so took a lot more, I would say, narrative leaps or ambitious steps that someone normally wouldn't have taken with a science fiction production, which also leads to, I would say, the surrealism, emphasis on personal horror and other moves that you can find in this particular piece, and especially the same year he did a famous Czech New Wave film called Josef Kilian, which is really about a guy who goes to a rental company that doesn't exist, that gets someone's cat and then moves around between these different spaces and trying to kind of discover, who is he, what's going on, I don't understand. And in complete contrast with French New Wave, it really does focus on the uncertainty of the human subject rather than the uncertainty of the film medium, which is, of course, the main subject of discussion under the French New Wave. Also, to come back to our director, one of the reasons, and this is again a issue that I'm dealing with in my own scholarship quite heavily, that Jindřich Polák is really not documented, is he was considered to be sort of what we call in German a Fachmann, or somebody who's just a really good specialist at making movies, who then, these people were extraordinarily important for the 1960s because they knew how horses worked, they knew how sets worked, they knew how lighting worked. But those people who know how all those things work aren't necessarily visionaries who then history lifts up later on.
We will talk about the first few scenes of this film where he definitely seems like he is a visionary. But before that, can you talk a little bit, Evan, about how the Eastern Bloc is collaborating during this time?
People like Jiří Vrcela, who's then not only included in this film, but also I believe he's playing Stevenson in this film, but he's also a villain then in East German westerns at the time. This actual film itself, Ikarie XB-1, has an extraordinary cast for Czech cinema at the time. Pretty much sort of all of the standard players who are there available at FAMU or in Barrandov Studios are also right there on set. So as Simon mentioned, this is directly a Czech New Wave studio and even state funded production. We were talking a little earlier. Evan always likes to comment on budgets. This would cost 5 million crowns if you're interested, and that would then be the upper end of the state level budget, but it would not break the budget like, say, another production would. So they still maintained the budget, and they reused the sets also for other production.
Very interesting. Okay, so let's talk, because so we watched Silent Star. It was interesting for me, and also the kind of the historical context is very interesting for me. But it didn't capture me. The first few scenes of Ikarie XB-1 absolutely were stunning.
These moments that you're spending staggering through a hallway that is lit in an absolutely expressionist fashion is
Very
of course
stark.
yeah, exactly. It's thanks to the camera work of Jan Kalisz, but also an idea that the psychological effects of this space travel should be, of course, emphasized. The later successors of this film are much more discussed in terms of these dimensions than Ikarie. So Ikarie's role in science fiction film history is this is the predecessor to 2001. Good. But it exists on its own terms, right? It exists beyond Anthony Fruin, bring it to Kubrick's attention in the late 60s. It exists on its own terms. And that means very concretely, there is a person who's quite psychologically disturbed, staggering through the hallways, cameras at canted angles, backlit, with these symmetrical spaces that are then made uncanny and surreal. And all of this kind of then adds up to a picture of a crew member who is going to destroy the ship because he no longer believes in the mission and has been affected by this dark star. But it also challenges us to think, well, who is the villain of this particular film and who is the hero of this particular film? And that narrative dynamic comes up again and again later on. We don't quite understand who we're supposed to be rooting for or not, and that's on purpose. So to some degree, we have a opening sequence of danger and of concern, and this is, of course, us as a film community reaching out to the community that we're seeing on screen.
Yeah, and when he says it's Earth is gone, that kind of suggests that he's not the villain, even and he's a desperate man. Simon, what do you think about those first few images?
I mean, they're certainly quite staggering, and I mean, it would be interesting, though, definitely not something we can know, but how first audience reacted to that. But because I mean, there wasn't that much space imagery which was firmly established among audiences. So there were some films where people were going to outer space, but it's interesting because I mean the whole visual design is really very much a thing of its own, and I mean it's certainly, if you compare it to something like Silent Star, but also something like Forbidden Planet, this looks very, very different.
I also wanted to mention, Simon, you might know the answer to this, because this idea of a psychological effect, like he's almost getting some kind of cabin fever. Now, we don't know the story yet when we see him at the beginning, but that obviously, as we go forward into like the future, which is our past, but as we go into film, that gets repeated in lots of different stories. But is this the kind of first time we're seeing someone being this affected by space travel?
The first example I'm aware of. And I mean, this whole idea of actually traveling through space really takes a long time. And there's a big toll to that. I think this certainly does exist already in literature, but in film, I don't think there's any movie which even thinks about that. They're just flying through space, and that this even if you would have a speed of light that it takes years, that's never really an issue until this point. And that this is something which obviously is something which must be extremely exhausting and depressing for the crew members. I don't think there's any movie before that. I mean,
you get the guy who's slightly unhappy in Forbidden Planet, and he's like, well, another planet, but it's not kind of serious. I think it's kind of played for the laughs.
I mean, you can put it in more general way. There are very few films until that point which actually show human beings going to outer space. There are a few, but in general, if you look at the science fiction film, it's always the aliens coming to Earth. There are very few going outer space. There are, I guess, several reasons for that, but one certainly is a budget. It's just more expensive having huge sets than having some alien creature coming to contemporary Earth.
And I think also that, like, culturally, the fear of the Russians like attacking has now gone on to the fear of winning the space race, or like the space race rather than, I mean, the nuclear issue is still there, and this is peak Cold War time, but the focus has now gone into how do we get into outer space, I guess. I just wanted to mention, because part of those first few scenes is the phenomenal, I was really, really shocked how good this music was. And that is by Zdeněk Liška. Apologies for my Czech pronunciation. So this guy has also done the music to Invention for Destruction, which is the fabulous world of Jules Verne, which we discussed earlier on. And apparently I've been reading about him, he was considered on par with Ennio Morricone in terms of how he was perceived in Czechoslovakia. And the reason we don't hear about him more often is he did a lot of kind of propaganda films as well. And so his legacy is now kind of coming out.
Well, I mean, he also did work with Schwankmajer as well. Jan Schwankmajer, the world's most famous stop motion animator, as well as a surrealist director. So I would say he jumped between different scenes. Liška did, and one of his hallmarks was his insistence on unusual instrumentation, pretty much from when it was available on. So, not only is he using theremin, but also sort of the latest in Eastern Bloc synthesizer tech for Ikarie.
I mean, it's interesting. I was a conference earlier this year where someone gave a paper on Liška and who came up with all these films, also science fiction films, which I have to confess, the only one I knew of was Ikarie XB-1. So he was very productive, and I think for a time he basically did the scores for anything that was of interest in Czechoslovakian cinema.
Okay, let's talk about this, the crew, this massive crew going off into space. And Simon, you talk a lot about utopias. So can we talk about this kind of communist utopia that's being built up in this film?
I mean, the interesting thing about this film, and I think this is somehow typical of this era and of this filmmaking, is this takes place in a future where obviously some of the basic problems of the 20th century have been solved. There is some, it's never really explained, but there is some kind of political union peace on Earth, and so they can have this diverse multinational crew. And the interesting thing is, it's never really spelled out or explained, but obviously communism has won, and we have peace on Earth, and that's it. But this is just taken as a fact. And this is, Ikarie XB-1 is often compared or took together with another film which was released the year before, The Man of the First Century, which is about the Czechoslovakian worker who ends up in the future, which is also a future where communism has won. And the one is a comedy, this is more like a, space drama. So in terms of genre, they're very different. But in both cases, you have this, the communism has won, the good future is there, but we don't really need to explain that. And I mean, you also have this in Silent Star, of course. But it's also interesting, and this is, as far as I know, also quite typical. And you also see this, for example, in Eastern Germany. Although this is a communist future, you don't have any communist insignia there. You don't have a red star, or you don't have the sickle and hammer. It is just taken for granted that this is obviously a communist future. And I imagine, but probably Evan can talk more about that this is actually, in a way, very liberating for the filmmakers, because in contrast to when they're making contemporary movies, they don't have to always bow to the ideology. They can just say, okay, this is a future where we have won, so now let's get to the interesting stuff.
If you are recruiting together a team to do the kind of special effects and set design and other specialty kind of work needed for such a film, you should not make it into a rah-rah propaganda film that then will they'll find disgraceful, right? And so there is actually a meeting point between sort of the state and personal interests there. If you want to get the kind of personnel want to work on this sort of thing, then of course you will need to tone down the communist imagery. And then the second point is international distribution. If you want these science fiction films to actually make money abroad, and that was a major consideration of Eastern Bloc film industries, even though communism, about abolition of capitalism, that's all smokescreen. It really does still depend on international markets buying the films, and so then you want to strike in more neutral tone, and even after a while of early 1960s dubs, including this one, making it to the American market, that then it became an intention a little bit for pictures in the Eastern Bloc to set up a international market where they could be received. But of course, then everything changes by the mid 60s, so that this dub market isn't as lucrative as it was, say, with the double feature drive-in environment of the early 60s, which would, of course, release Ikari to the US audience.
Interesting. Can we talk a bit about the very vast crew and all these people? Because you absolutely adore this film. And I visually adore it. But I'm quite a simple person, and I quite like having a protagonist that I can follow through with on the story. So I'm like, okay, I'm feeling for this person, it's going to this person, and it feels very spread out. Now, this is obviously also to do with Western storytelling, hero's journey. But can you tell me a bit about a few of your favorite characters and how you think this works as an ensemble cast?
To be specific, one thing is, this is a sociological film, and they have a sociologist on board, to talk about the sort of replicated societal effects on this particular configuration of people, if we put it that way, and then you have a number of different cast members, sort of up and down the um, up and down the spectrum of human society. Zdeněk Stepanek is our commander, and he really does strike me as like an old factory like owner kind of guy. He doesn't strike me as a military person at all, but like he's what we know from the East German and Czech and Polish tradition. The old guard who saw the 1920s and knows what earlier industrialization and factory work is like now in the 60s, except this happens to be a spaceship. And so he relies on that sort of attitude, as well as his care for the safety of everyone on board. Which is also going to drive some conflict again around the pregnancy that's happening on board. How do you keep a baby safe in these hostile conditions, where, say, a cosmic effect will force everybody to fall asleep or similar. Radiation is also a massive problem in the space. I have to emphasize, space is trying to kill you in so many different ways, and in order to create this kind of generational ship, you'll have to have so many different forms of redundancy. And so if you begin to look at this not as a science fiction storytelling problem, but as an engineering problem, now you're stuck in areas that also are not that interesting to you as an audience member. And so does the scientific realities, if someone takes all this very seriously, are to some degree too boring, as well as the utopia is also too boring. And somewhere in the middle ground is just normal humans living out their lives, having a workplace, having romance, having these kinds of dramas. So I guess to answer your question, I don't have a favorite character. This crew is my favorite character, and this crew is a set of humans in various circumstances. I also don't blame those who are lost, who lose their minds, or who are lost on this journey. They didn't do anything wrong, and of course the counterpoint to that is the capitalist, the capitalist ship that they happen to run to.
We'll call it a capitalist ship. I like that. They think about so much in terms of like the fact that they carry around pebbles and earth to remind them of home. And they're bringing all these kind of, this guy wants to get a flower so he can woo this woman that he likes on the ship. And then they've got this fantastic gym, which is like it reminded me a bit of Starship Troopers, but without the nudity, because I'm sure that's like a bit of a tip of the hat.
There's some very fit bodies in there still. I mean, they're not completely nude, but
absolutely.
But I think it's also interesting is that think about all the stuff, but if you then look at how are actually the rooms where people live in actually look like, then there again we have this cabins, which is really, really strange. And on the one hand, you have then they have this party, and the women are really wearing these very exquisite robes. And
I love how 60s the party is. It's very late 50s, early 60s. I love it. How
you have this really very extravagant wardrobe, but no one thinks about actually providing quarters for the people where you say, okay, why don't we have quarters to live in which actually look like a real apartment? You still have these typical boxes, which I think is interesting. And we have flowers, and we have a great gym, but somehow the places where people actually live, I don't think they look very comfy.
Yeah, it's interesting because they get later to the point where everyone's a bit bored, and they're bored of the gym, and they're bored of each other, and they're bored of everything. They're like, oh, well, I might as well walk across the spaceship because I've got nothing else to do. But in regards to the 60s party, which is wonderful, I was just wondering because, you've still got this kind of the hangover of the, communism, which would see a lot of things as being bourgeoisie, but it does feel like a very kind of upper class kind of party. It doesn't seem like people, and so I just wondered how that would. Is that just because it's the future, or are there other examples of this era which would have similar things?
I mean, 1960s were also the heyday of the socialist musical, and so a portrayal of abundance is not without precedent, and there's no reason why to withhold that abundance for a sort of austere presence in the early 60s. I think that the party was heartfelt and more or less in alignment with the values of the creators. It was not imposed by anyone. It said this is the kind of party we would probably like to go to, which then also with another lovely narrative decision I appreciate is that they have to abruptly stop the party and go to their stations in their party uniform, in all of their finery. That to me is also extremely much in the ideological universe of this film. How do we be our full people, so we are at once always on duty and always ready to serve the workplace, and on the other hand we can relax a little bit together, right?
I called it the not red alert, but it felt very much like a Star Trek red alert, but it's black and white. There's no red. But the sound, and they go running off. Can we talk a bit about what they encounter now, which you described as the capitalist ship? Simon, let's go to you first.
I think it's really interesting, both in the way how this is shot, how they work with this zero gravity and all these strange angles, and you never really know where you are. And also what they encounter these dead bodies of this expedition from the late 20th century. And as it turns out, because of some miscalculation, they started killing each other off until then the last crew members were dead. You have atomic weapons there, so you really have the Cold War is very present there. What I think is also really interesting is then you have sound design there, and because in the beginning you have when you have the spaceship flying through space, you have this you have some sound effects which are not really clear whether they're diegetic or not, meaning whether they are part of the world or not. But certainly this spaceship makes some sounds when it flies through space. It's not silent. But when they are then on the ship, then it is silent, and you have only the music going on there. And then the explosion of the atomic warhead is silent again, which is really kind of interesting, and it's something which famously in films like Star Wars you would never see. In an explosion in Star Wars, there's always a lot of noise because an explosion without noise loses much of its effect. But here they decided, which I think is really quite a courageous decision, having an explosion without sound, which really you normally would not do that because you lose half the effect of the explosion. But
yeah, people have gone to the cinema to see spectacle and hear spectacle, and then doing it without that.
This is also obviously the point where the utopia is like contrasted with this is where we are coming from. This is what we have left behind, or this is what we have overcome. This is like really ancient history.
They call it primitive, don't they?
Exactly. And I think also, as much as you can read this as propaganda, I think it's really actually quite elegantly done because they never say, yeah, thankfully we then had the workers' revolution, I don't know, in 1999 and everything was, but it's really told narratively over through the plot, which I think is quite smart.
Evan?
I adore this sequence in part because it combines sort of the horror elements as well as it's what we call an overdetermined signifier in which everything that's possibly wrong about capitalism gets lumped all together. So we have the nuclear weapons, we have environmental poison, gambling, decadence, people killing each other, for selfish reasons. And it's this really lovely foil of, everything that's wrong with society kind of lumped into a sequence that then ultimately becomes a trap that kills two crew members, right? And it's a contrast against then what we will then experience towards the end of the film as an environmental obstacle, but not one that, the Dark Star, but that's not one that's a societal obstacle. So one of the things I like about this sequence is that it touches upon, as Simon was saying, all of these other topics in an elegant way that then doesn't have to be dogmatically invoked in the narrative, but that then you can still say, no, this utopian environment is still very real. There was struggle that got to this point, and there is a sort of violent capitalist other that has to be expelled in order for this world to be possible.
Yes, it is a really interesting sequence because obviously we're looking at it, and it's more interesting because we're not in 1963, but obviously they're looking at their future, which is now in their past, and it's making commentary on the present, which is admittedly a lot of science fiction, but I thought it was really, even though it was slightly heavy-handed, but I think it was done really well. And there's definitely people who would kill everyone else on the crew to survive. That's still relevant, I think. Can we talk a little bit about the science in this? Because this is the first time I think we're talking about, the time dilation and various other things, which, again, like these are not things that I've seen so far in the science fiction. There are some films like Destination Moon where they do get really kind of a bit too specific with the science. But it's interesting here. Simon?
I think especially the comparison with Destination Moon is interesting because if you look at stuff like the design of the spaceship, there's nothing scientific there. And you have all these lights going on and strange stuff and some, I don't know, some liquids in tubes doing crazy things. And obviously this stuff is all just there because it looks nice and not because there was some engineer thinking about, okay, how we should build this. But at the same time, as you said, you have stuff like time dilation, which is actually, they talk about it, but they never actually explain like the physics behind it, which I think is quite extraordinary. They just more or less take for granted that with these few hints, you understand.
That is interesting because we obviously have watched enough stuff now to be able to know what that means, but they don't explain it at all in the
exactly. Which I don't know, but I don't think that the average moviegoer at that time actually really knew what was going on. And if you compare it to terrible movie like Interstellar, where they spend half an hour talking about stuff like that and explaining it, it's really interesting that this movie doesn't think it's necessary to do that.
Don't hurt my feelings, Simon, but go ahead.
No, it's time dilation and all these effects there, but also, I mean, you already mentioned it, all the effects of actually encountering this vast space, this huge travel that they're making. All this stuff is, I think, is really the first time in a movie. And I mean, at the same time, I also find it interesting in this kind of movie is, they're talking about the effects of time dilation and what this means if you leave your loved one behind on Earth, but somehow the characters, they only really start to think about it once they're on the trip. But that's somehow part of
they can't think about it off camera, can they?
No, but I mean, you would think that actually this is something you really spend a lot of time discussing before you actually leave, and not then when you're on the ship and then calling your wife and maybe that's not such a good idea, but we'll meet again in 10 years. And,
by the time you've had a child that you decided not to tell me about. Evan, can we talk a bit about, I actually just want to mention Patrick, the little robot, because I do love it when they have robots in science fiction films. And it is a bit of a throwback to Robbie the Robot from Forbidden Planet.
I mean, it's interesting that this is also in the world of the movie. This is old tech. Someone called him the miracle of the last century, which is also interesting because in a way this is like, oh, you have this really fancy robot, but that's old stuff.
And unlike the book, so this is set in 2163, so it's still not our present when we're doing this. So Evan, can you tell me a bit about the science, and then I also want you to talk a bit about dark matter because who doesn't want to hear about that?
Yeah, I mean the science is again. When you have a science fiction travel narrative like this, what they are doing is akin to magic. Everything from gravity working on the ship to solving radiation problems, solving long-term fuel storage costs and everything. So they have the time dilation effect, which I think puts them in space for maybe 4 months before they then find the planet with life on it. Gosh, if only we could do that. The what if question, right? Every science fiction film is powered by a what if question, and this is what if your community, in your Czech community in the early 1960s, does now have to spend months and months together on this ship, and it's almost too science fictional to say now you're going to have to spend 10 years together in a society. Traveling, even our own Mars plans, which I think is like a 2-year journey out to Mars and then back. Now that 4 years is so science fictional as to be unbelievable, right? We don't have even the imaginative capacity to deal with that right now. And so I feel as though this film is at least ambitiously saying, well, what humans can't sit alone in rooms for very long, so why would we then think that this whole generation ship idea would even work? And so I guess the science behind this is,
and I'm assuming everyone knows the concept of generation ship, which is basically you have more than one generation on a ship. I just wanted to get that out there. Sorry, continue.
And how would we then get a generation ship in which the next generation would rebel completely against what what the values were that put them in this place to begin with? And I just want to end like this part is just to say that this vignette with the capitalist ship, the dark matter, dark star, and some of the other encounters are even like almost distractions from the psychological horror that could be at the center of the entire film, of just what it's like when you really do just have to be with people for a really long time in these really similar circumstances.
And I mean, it's interesting that even today, I think you have very few films which really take this idea up. I mean, you have something like Sunshine, where you have like the captain going crazy and stuff, but really about just this effect of being together for a very long time with no possibility of going outside. I don't think there are many movies which really take this as their core idea. I mean, there are also, I guess, obvious reasons for that. Watching people doing nothing is, let's say, it's not easy to pull that off and make and turn it into an interesting plot.
Yeah, I think if you have some kind of like unknown element or a supernatural element, like if you go down the Event Horizon route, then it becomes more interesting. But just people sitting around and getting cabin fever, it might not work so well. Evan, are you done with your dark matter shenanigans?
No, I'm not.
Please, go ahead.
What's interesting about this film is the invocation of the Dark Star towards the end, I would say the main threat after capitalism. And of course, the Dark Star comes from an idea developed in the 1930s by Fritz Zwicky, the dark matter, dunkle Materie, as they call it. And that had been in scientific parlance for about 30 years, again, by the time this film was made. Very much hotly debated. It was not really established scientific fact until Vera Rubin in the United States proved it by the early 70s that our galaxy has way too much matter for any of the physics to work. And now dark matter is absolutely established scientific fact. We don't understand it, but we know that we know that 85% of the universe is it, and that it comes from the fact that we tend to measure everything with light, but that then this is immune to measurement with light. So if you look into the film, right, film is nothing but creating things with light and of course sound, that now you're looking at a threat that you can't really see, that you can't really summarize well, that attacks the characters sort of from turning their bodies against them. For me, this is a moment where Ikari poses the question, what do we know? What can we know about that? And of course, there's an implication that this dark star is perhaps even controlled by the Alpha Centauri residents to, gatekeep their planet, which is, again, a giant black box that we're never going to open, that you would be able to control dark matter in this way. But it is an interesting idea, nonetheless.
They're talking about things that they don't know, but there's a point, and I think it could be Hopkins who says it, who says something along the lines of, they insisted nothing new could be discovered in the universe. They've been proclaiming this for 300 years. Have they?
I just want to say that one of the key tensions for me in the film is this, I guess, division between statements they make where they say, I don't know the answer to that, or what's going on, versus I absolutely know the answer to this, and here's exactly what's going on. And those statements of certainty defy logic oftentimes. They defy also a lot of the suspense mechanisms of the film. So if there was one thing I said that Ikari does not do well, it is actually its own internal dialogue, uncertainty, certainty dynamic. I don't ever understand what the characters really know or what they don't know.
Yeah. Can we talk very briefly about this whole concept? So the radiation's about to kill them all. And then you have this kind of split where the commander seems to be saying, no, we can't rely on faith, but he has faith or he wants answers. It's a very confusing but very interesting part where he's kind of suggesting that we can't rely on faith because that would be religion, but he believes in man's ability to overcome by just being tougher or something like that. What do you get from that?
How do you motivate people around something they no longer believe in? And this is, in the wake of Stalinism, a very real issue throughout the Eastern Bloc. Okay, we acknowledge that millions of people have been murdered under the sort of slogans of communism. What do we do with that legacy? Well, you still have to get up in the morning and work on your projects. And so where does that belief come from? What do you believe in? And so this is a sort of crude form of existentialism that I feel also refracts through the entire Czech New Wave. They're all existentialist films. They're all asking, what do you do when you don't believe in something, but you have to do something anyway?
Interesting. Simon, let's talk about the ending. So we're heading to the white planet, and a baby is born. So it's a very, very optimistic ending after all of the trauma of potentially everyone dying from radiation.
Is it? No, I guess it is. But what is certainly really fascinating is that we only get the barest of glimpse of this white planet. I mean, in a way, it makes absolute sense that they don't show this world, because in a way, it would be destined to be a letdown because it cannot live up to expectations. But on the other hand, I think it's also quite brave saying, okay, actually, no. Now we went through all this hassle we had to endure, and now we're just stopping here, which I think is really quite quite a brave decision. And in a way, I mean, the comparison with 2001 has already been made. I think this is in a way really quite comparable to the ending of 2001, where, okay, now the new time is here.
They both feature babies.
Both feature babies, but it's also like, this is now the new time, the new thing, whatever it is. But now we're stopping here because we're not going to show that, which is also, we come back to Utopia, which is also very typical, I would say, for a film that you never see Utopia in film, because then it, in a way, it's always actually a disappointment, and it's also will soon be boring. We only ever get a glimpse of Utopia, and I mean, certainly the suggestion is that the people living in this world they are encountering, they are friendly because they help them. So this first contact is going to be a positive first contact.
Evan, should we talk about the US edit, which apparently completely changes the film?
Yeah,
in a very simple way.
Yeah, so this is again a question of endings. They discover at the end of the U.S. film that the green planet, which they're talking about artificially,
rather than the white planet,
the white planet, the green planet turns out to be planet Earth. And so this is akin to you wake up and it was all a dream or something like that. Okay, you went out to find another planet and oh look, it's Earth instead. This device, of course, comes up in Planet of the Apes. It comes up in Operation Ganymede from West Germany in 1977. There's a whole slew of films where this device is used.
And it was my understanding that they not only changed the ending, but also insofar that these are actually not people from Earth on their trip, but these are actually aliens.
It's the old switcheroo.
Well, yeah. So again, these are aliens coming to Earth, but then you ask yourself, what are these aliens supposed to? What you have fewer answers to your questions and your questions,
and they use Earth script, and they and they're also the 60s affected these aliens as well.
Obviously for commercial reasons, because the idea was if we sell this to US audiences, they are put off by all these Eastern European names. They also changed all the names of all the credits. So the director in the US version is Jack Pollock, which I think is really funny. And also all the actors, they have different names.
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, let's quickly move on to Legacy. Simon first.
I mean, we already talked about 2001 several times, and also this is often mentioned. I'm actually really hesitant to confirm that. I mean, Evan has already mentioned that briefly. We know that Kubrick has seen the movie. Anthony Frevin, who was one of his close collaborators, confirmed that. Whether it actually really was an influence, I'm not so sure, because...
So the two scenes, so the scene of the corridor and the scene where I've actually put this up on social media, so if you go to my social media, it's really, really similar. Like the lines going out from the corridor, and when you've got Dave in the kind of white corridor, it's visually very, very comparable. So yeah, it's interesting how far that would go, though.
I mean, yeah, we don't know. I mean, there's certainly a line you can draw there, and you can certainly also draw a line from Ikarie to another, probably the most famous Lem adaptation, which is Solaris. So there is certainly a legacy there. But I'm not sure whether you can call it legacy, but for me, actually, the first encounter with Jindřich Pollard was something completely different, because in the 80s, he did a lot of children's television, a lot of several series, children miniseries. And at that time, there was a lot of collaboration between Germany, both East and Western Germany, and Czechoslovakia. And as a child, I watched several of these series. And this was a kind of children's program. They don't make them anymore like that. They are very charming, often fantasy, science fiction stuff, funny, but also in a way really taking the audience, the children, and also their material serious. One thing, and I remember quite vividly. There was this one series, The Visitors, that's also a science fiction story, and there you have an utopia in the future, and they are threatened by a meteor which will collide with Earth. And they know they have this genius, this Nobel Prize winner, who, when he was a small child, actually developed a formula how you could move planets around. And so they know, but it was lost. And so then, okay, we actually have a solution. So we have to travel back in time in order to get that formula. And he would also do, which was also very successful in the German-speaking work, Pantau, about this kind of magician who travels the world. There were several series of that. So he was, I would say, for people in my generation, growing up with German television, I think no one of them would know the name Pollack, but they all know Pantau, they all know The Visitors.
So children's programming.
Exactly.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Evan?
Again, the parallels between this and 2001 are striking in part because of symmetry, actually, that both Kubrick and the team on Ikari are concerned with things being symmetrical so that then they can undermine them, flip them, put them at different angles. The symmetry, of course, being, expression of modernist architecture, modernist even thinking, and then, both films are looking to make them uncanny or at least call them into question. For me, the legacy beyond this, of course, hard science fiction is hard to do well at budget and it still maintain its audience. And so I would say the main sort of inheritor of this particular film is a Japanese manga series called Planetus, which was, I think it was in the 2000s, and then also got its own series, and that of course also deals with the psychological effects of long-term space and habitation, and is really, again, asking questions about characters' pasts and concerned about community in this long-term sort of prison almost environment, versus larger science fiction questions. And I think that that gulf between the microcosm of I played one too many chess game on this godforsaken voyage, and we are exploring giant questions of regarding humans' place in the cosmos. That's really powerful.
Very interesting. Thank you. Okay, and now on to a recommendation for the listener. So I've asked you both to bring something in your minds along to recommend. Evan this time.
Well, there's the film I'm currently writing on, which is a 1984 production, West German production called Decoder, which is a by the band members Throbbing Gristle, among other people, and is a and I would say shares the unnerving soundscape of this particular film.
And that
And
makes it interesting.
yeah, and again, and the premise of that film is that there's an evil corporation using Muzak to control everyone's minds, and the early industrial music movement will use their cut up technique, including a cameo by William S. Burroughs, to break everyone's brains.
Very interesting. Okay, I have to get to that. Simon.
So my recommendation would be another movie by Pollack from 1977, which has the fabulous title in English, Tomorrow I Wake Up and Scald Myself with Tea. So this is about some Nazis, but later day Nazis, so that's after war. And so in the 70s, they are somewhere in South America. And at that time, they already have time travel, but time travel at that time is only used for like holiday trips. So you travel to the back into ancient Egypt and see how people built the pyramids and stuff. And their plan is that they will capture one of these time traveling rockets and then going back to 1944 Germany, I think, and hand over a hydrogen bomb to Hitler and therefore make him win the war.
Thank you so much to both of you for coming on the show.
It was our pleasure.
Thank you.
Great. that's it for this episode. Next episode, I will be taking a detour to talk about Afrofuturism before we go back to the busy business of watching films. If you are able to support the podcast, please do. You can do that by leaving a nice rating or review in your favourite podcasting app. If you don't like the episode, you can move on to other episodes and other shows. If you want to support the podcast financially, you can do that by going to my Patreon channel, which is patreon.com/every sci-fi film. And there for just $3 or £3 a month, you can get ad-free versions of the podcast. Thank you so much to all of my Patreon subscribers, and I will see you again next time. Bye-bye.